We like to believe we can recognize evil when we see it. A certain look in the eyes, a strange edge in the voice, a feeling in the gut that says something isn't right. But the truth is far more unsettling. Most of the people who commit the world's darkest crimes look perfectly ordinary. They blend into crowds, shake hands at work, hold polite conversations at bus stops. They live beside us, sometimes with us, carrying an invisible double life that no one suspects until it's too late. That is what terrifies us most about serial killers. Not only what they do, but how normal they seem while doing it. The mask is convincing, the performance flawless. And the moment we realize that, something fundamental inside us begins to fracture our sense of safety. Because if someone capable of the unthinkable can look exactly like the man next door, what does that say about the boundaries of human nature? Are they truly separate from us? Or are they the extreme end of something that already exists in every human mind? Every generation rediscovers this fear. The headlines change, the names change, the methods change, but the unease remains that we tell ourselves that monsters are rare, that they're broken machines born without empathy. We cling to that idea because it protects us that if killers are monsters, then they're nothing like us. If they're insane, they're an exception to the rule of humanity. But the more we learn about them, the less that comfort holds up. Think about it. The neighbor who waves every morning. The coworker who brings coffee for everyone. The stranger who smiles at you in the elevator. In most stories, evil wears a warning sign. In real life, it wears a disguise so convincing we never see the danger coming. That's the first fracture point. Realizing how easily darkness hides in plain sight. Once that illusion of safety breaks, suspicion seeps in. Communities become uneasy. Every unfamiliar gesture starts to look like a potential threat. And in that vacuum of trust, fear becomes culture. Each new discovery of a serial killer tears through that fragile sense of order. News reports dissect their lives, the quiet childhoods, the polite manners, the eerie calmness. The more ordinary they seem, the deeper our collective confusion grows. Because how can something so cruel coexist with something so human? Families of victims are left suspended between grief and unanswered questions. Their days become anchored to the hope of explanation. But explanation rarely satisfies that it's never just one reason. It's an intricate combination of mind, memory, and environment. And yet, as a society, we keep looking for a single word that will make sense of it all. Monster, psycho, evil, easy words for complex truths. Those words comfort us because they draw a boundary. They tell us that killers are outside the human circle. But in drawing that boundary, we also blind ourselves. We stop asking why and start saying who cares. And each time we do, we miss the opportunity to recognize the early signs, to understand the architecture of cruelty before it's too late. Look at our fascination with these people. Every streaming platform hosts a dozen true crime documentaries at any given time. Podcasts replay the same police tapes again and again. We read books about their motives, their methods, their final words. Part of us is horrified, but another part is irresistibly drawn in. We want to understand. We want to believe that by studying them, we can protect ourselves from them. Yet deep down, we also suspect that what attracts us is something darker. The forbidden recognition that they, too, are human. We turn killers into characters. We watch dramatizations where actors recreate their gestures, their interviews, their trials. And for a moment, the distance between us and them narrows. They become the mirror image of our own impulses, stripped of conscience and magnified beyond control. That reflection is what truly disturbs us, because it suggests that the line between empathy and apathy, compassion and cruelty, is thinner than we'd ever admit. But fascination has consequences. Every hour of screen time devoted to these figures keeps their memory alive in culture. They become archetypes, the charming sociopath, the calculating genius, the remorseless predator. Meanwhile, The victims fade into background noise. The stories of lives lost are replaced by the spectacle of the mind that took them. In studying evil, we risk glamorizing it. And still, we keep watching. Because each new name reopens the same question. Why? Why do they kill? What do they feel? How does someone reach that point where another person's life means nothing? Scientists, criminologists, and psychologists have spent decades trying to map that territory. Some point to childhood trauma, the absence of love, the presence of violence, the pattern of neglect that rewires the brain's understanding of empathy. Others trace it to biology, anomalies in the amygdala, underactive empathy circuits, heightened impulsivity in the prefrontal cortex. But none of those factors alone creates a killer. There are countless people who suffer trauma, who live with similar brain differences, and never harm a soul. So what combination turns potential into catastrophe? That's where the mystery deepens. A serial killer's psychology is not a single cause. It's a collision. A collision between vulnerability and opportunity, between nature and nurture, between imagination and obsession. And at the center of that collision is a human brain searching, like any other, for control, identity, and meaning. Imagine a child growing up in an environment where pain is constant and attention is unpredictable. In that world, control becomes currency. The child learns that power equals safety. Over time, that need for control transforms into a lens through which every relationship is viewed. People become objects to manipulate rather than connect with. Emotions become tools rather than experiences. And slowly, the ability to feel empathy erodes, not in a single moment, but in thousands of small, invisible steps. Most serial killers don't wake up one day and decide to murder. Their journey is gradual, a series of internal permissions granted over years. A fantasy that begins as imagination becomes rehearsal. A rehearsal becomes obsession. And eventually, obsession demands reality. By the time the first act of violence occurs, the moral brakes that stop most people from crossing that line are gone, or were never fully developed in the first place. Yet, we rarely understand this process because we've been taught to search for simplicity. We prefer one-word explanations, clean categories, good and evil, sane and insane, human and monster. But the brain doesn't work in absolutes, that it's chemistry, circuitry, and context. It's capable of compassion and cruelty using the same neural networks. And sometimes, those networks misfire in ways that science still struggles to map. The most haunting truth is that the seeds of cruelty are not foreign to us. They exist in everyone. The flashes of rage, the desire for dominance, the fantasies of control. In healthy minds, those impulses are moderated by empathy, guilt, and social learning. In others, those moderating systems fail, leaving only raw impulse. Understanding that continuum doesn't justify violence, but it explains its possibility. That's why the phrase born evil is misleading. No one is born with a destiny to kill. They are born with a brain, and that brain develops in a world of experiences that shape it. Some of those experiences teach empathy, others teach indifference. And somewhere between those two lessons, a fracture can occur. To truly grasp the mind of a serial killer, we have to discard the myths. They're not all masterminds. They're not all geniuses or recluses or tortured artists. Many are simply ordinary people whose internal compass has lost magnetic north. They operate by logic that makes sense only to them. Logic built on control, gratification, and the absence of emotional consequence. When they look at a victim, they don't see a person. They see an opportunity to feel something, even if that feeling is born from destruction. It's this combination, emptiness and stimulation, that drives repetition. The first act provides a rush of power, the second, an attempt to recreate it. But like any addiction, the high fades faster each time. So they escalate. Method becomes ritual. Ritual becomes identity. And before long, The act of killing isn't about the victim at all. It's about maintaining the illusion of control over their own chaotic inner world. Our failure to understand this complexity keeps us vulnerable, because by insisting that evil must look different, we ignore the ordinary faces capable of extraordinary harm. We underestimate the subtle signs, the lack of empathy masked by charm, the manipulation disguised as warmth, the fascination with power hidden behind politeness. And when we finally notice, it's often too late. The unsettling truth is that serial killers are not a separate species. They are an extreme reflection of traits that exist on a spectrum: narcissism, impulsivity, lack of remorse. These traits appear in many people, just in milder, socially contained forms. In a few, the balance tips too far. The same brain mechanisms that motivate success, confidence, or desire can, under certain conditions, morph into obsession, domination, and violence. The wiring isn't alien, it's misaligned. This is the point where fear meets fascination. We fear them because they remind us of what happens when the safeguards of conscience fail. We're fascinated because they reveal the fragility of those safeguards. And so, the study of the criminal mind becomes more than an exercise in criminology. It becomes a mirror held up to humanity itself. To make sense of the chaos inside a killer's mind, we need a structure, a lens clear enough to separate myth from mechanism. Because what drives these individuals isn't random insanity. It's patterned. It's behavioral. And beneath the horror, there is method. At the Mind Lab studio, we call this the behavioral triad framework, a way to decode the criminal psyche through three intersecting dimensions: impulse, empathy, and control. Three forces that, in balance, define the boundaries of normal human behavior. And when they fracture, they create a mind capable of extraordinary destruction. The first axis is impulse, the raw, unfiltered drive toward action. In most people, impulse is a whisper that's quickly moderated by reason. You feel anger, but you don't strike. You feel curiosity, but you know where the moral line lies. Inside the mind of a serial killer, that whisper becomes a roar. The internal voice that says stop grows silent. This isn't just a choice, it's biology. In imaging studies, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for inhibition and moral decision-making, shows reduced activity in individuals with psychopathic tendencies. The brakes are faulty. Impulse takes over the wheel. But impulse alone doesn't explain the pattern. A person might act impulsively once, but a serial killer returns to the act. That's where the second axis comes in: empathy. Empathy is what allows us to recognize another person's pain as real. It's the mechanism that makes cruelty unbearable to witness. But in some individuals, that circuit is dim, like a light struggling to stay on. When the empathy switch flickers off, others become objects, not people. Their suffering becomes meaningless, or worse, stimulating. And this isn't mere indifference, it's neurological absence. Brain scans of known psychopaths reveal underactivity in the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. The same image that would evoke horror or guilt in a typical person evokes nothing in them. The emotional resonance that binds humanity simply isn't there. Then comes the third axis: control. If impulse is the engine and empathy the brakes, control is the steering. Control defines direction, method, and purpose. It's the aspect that transforms random violence into ritualized behavior. Many killers describe their acts as performances, each detail premeditated, each movement deliberate. It's in this control that they find meaning. When life feels chaotic, control becomes a substitute for identity. Killing becomes an assertion of existence. I am powerful. I am real. That need for control often traces back to childhood environments where chaos reigned. Abuse, neglect, or emotional unpredictability teaches the developing brain that control equals safety. As adults, that need mutates into domination. the one area of life where they can feel certain, even if that certainty is drenched in blood. When these three forces, impulse, empathy, and control, intersect in imbalance, the result is a mind primed for predation. High impulse, low empathy, high control. That's the behavioral triad signature found across most serial offender profiles. They act without moral hesitation, feel nothing for their victims, and derive gratification from orchestrating every moment of the crime. It's not random. It's an engineered psychological pattern. Of course, not all killers fit neatly into one mold. To understand the variations, researchers categorize them by motivation, the why behind the pattern. And within the behavioral triad, we can view motivation as an extension of whichever axis dominates. The first category is power-oriented, killers driven by control. They don't simply want to kill, they want to command. For them, murder isn't the end, it's the theater of dominance. Every scream, every plea, every silence reinforces the illusion of omnipotence they crave. Their sense of self depends on the total submission of another. The second is lust-oriented, where impulse and control merge in twisted harmony. Pleasure and pain become indistinguishable. In their brains, the circuits that link arousal to empathy are miswired. What should inhibit becomes what excites. These individuals pursue the repetition of sensation, the perfect recreation of the fantasy that first awakened their obsession. Each act is a rehearsal of the same internal script, trying to perfect the emotion that never truly satisfies. Then come the thrill-oriented killers, the ones who kill for stimulation itself. Their lives often feel numb, colorless, meaningless. Violence provides a rare spike in emotion, a chemical high born from fear and risk. They are addicted not to blood, but to adrenaline. Each kill temporarily floods the brain with dopamine, producing the same rush that addicts chase through drugs or gambling. But like any addiction, the brain adapts. The high dulls, the escalation begins. And so, the thrill seeker becomes trapped in a cycle of his own making, a biochemical loop that demands more danger, more intensity, more death. Finally, there are the profit-oriented killers, those whose motivation hides behind logic. They kill not for emotion, but for advantage, money, security, or status. At first glance, they seem the most rational of all, but beneath that rationality lies the same absence of empathy. They can destroy a life as easily as deleting a file. For them, morality is a math problem. If the reward outweighs the risk, the act becomes justifiable. Across these categories, power, lust, thrill, profit, runs a single common thread, the fracture of empathy. Without empathy, morality collapses into calculation. Without guilt, there are no boundaries to desire. That is the hidden architecture of evil, not demonic possession, not supernatural darkness, but a biological and psychological malfunction that distorts how the self perceives others. Understanding this mechanism transforms how we see the serial killer narrative. It shifts the focus from sensational crime scenes to invisible neural pathways. It moves the question from who are they to what happened inside them, because no one is born fully formed as a predator. They are shaped, reinforced, and often unnoticed until the pattern has taken root. This is where the behavioral triad framework becomes more than theory. It becomes a diagnostic lens. By studying early warning signs across those three axes, psychologists can often identify risk patterns long before violence begins. On the axis of impulse, early red flags include chronic risk-taking, thrill-seeking without consequence, and emotional volatility that escalates under frustration. On the empathy axis, the signs are subtler: indifference to others' pain, cruelty toward animals, or using charm to manipulate rather than connect. And on the control axis, it's the obsessive need for dominance, turning relationships into hierarchies, seeing cooperation as weakness, craving victory even in trivial interactions. These signals alone don't make someone a killer. But when they overlap, when low empathy meets high control and high impulse, the risk multiplies. It's in that intersection that patterns of predation often begin. Imagine viewing every criminal profile through this lens. Instead of trying to decode endless motives, we could map their behaviors onto a triad. A power-dominant offender leans toward controlled planning and ritual. An impulse-dominant one acts chaotically, driven by emotional volatility. An empathy-deficient type hides behind charm, manipulating perception until the moment of action. It's not a perfect science, but it provides clarity, a structured way to translate the chaos of violence into a pattern the human mind can comprehend. An understanding brings a strange kind of relief, because once the pattern is visible, the fear loses some of its power. We stop seeing serial killers as incomprehensible monsters and start seeing them as broken systems, predictable, identifiable, and, in some cases, preventable. That shift in perspective changes everything. It transforms horror into insight. That it moves us from helplessness to understanding. And understanding is the beginning of prevention. Think of it like this. Empathy isn't just what keeps us moral, it's what keeps us human. The moment empathy collapses, everything else becomes possible. Violence isn't born from mystery, it's born from absence. And by identifying that absence early, through the behavioral triad, we gain not only knowledge, but foresight. So what does this clarity give us? To recognize that the killer's smile, the polite small talk, the perfect alibi, all of it is camouflage built around a neurological void. It teaches us that what we call evil is not supernatural. It's systemic, that it's the mind, stripped of empathy, guided by impulse, obsessed with control. And that recognition allows us to look at the darkness without glorifying it, to study it without becoming its audience. For decades, humanity has been content with caricatures, the madman, the villain, the fiend. But understanding the criminal mind requires something more dangerous, the willingness to see the human beneath the horror. Because once we see that, the illusion breaks. The killer is no longer a myth, but a malfunction. A chilling reminder of how fragile the architecture of morality truly is. And perhaps that's the most frightening realization of all. Not that serial killers exist, but that the distance between their mind and ours is smaller than we ever imagined. Because empathy, impulse, and control live inside every brain. And when those lines blur, when those balances fail, the mind itself becomes the weapon. To understand the mind of a serial killer is to stare into a mirror, one that reflects not only horror, but humanity's deepest psychological truths. Because in the end, every monster is made, not born. And if we can trace the making, we can begin to understand the mechanism. The science calls it psychopathy, a clinical condition defined by emotional detachment, shallow affect, and the absence of remorse. It's not rage. It's not insanity. It's cold logic without conscience. Studies show that roughly 1% of the population exhibits psychopathic traits, yet only a fraction become violent. So the question isn't who has the potential, it's what activates it. One of the earliest attempts to map that activation came from what criminologists call the Macdonald Triad, a pattern of childhood behaviors that can hint at future violent tendencies. Cruelty to animals, fire setting, and persistent bedwetting past the normal developmental age. For decades, investigators treated these as warning signs, the red flags of emerging sociopathy. But modern psychology paints a more complex picture. These behaviors don't create killers, they signal trauma. They are early echoes of a nervous system under siege. A child who tortures animals isn't born evil. He's externalizing his own pain, mirroring the powerlessness he's experienced. Fire setting becomes symbolic, a momentary feeling of control in a world where control was stolen. In case after case, we find the same thread. Early chaos breeds adult obsession. Consider Ted Bundy, charming, intelligent, educated. To the outside world, a law student with ambition. Yet beneath the facade was a man who described himself as possessed by an entity. Bundy's early life was built on lies, raised believing his mother was his sister, his grandparents his parents. This confusion fractured his identity, planting seeds of emotional detachment long before his first crime. What the world saw as charisma was, in truth, an evolved survival mechanism, a mask refined through years of pretending everything was normal. Then there's Jeffrey Dahmer, the quiet boy from Wisconsin who collected animal bones in his backyard. As a child, Dahmer watched his parents' marriage dissolve into shouting matches and silence. He found fascination in the anatomy of death, not because he was cruel, but because death was predictable. It stayed still. It couldn't leave him. Over time, that fascination metastasized into obsession, and obsession into horror. When police eventually entered his apartment, they didn't just find evidence of murder. They found the physical manifestation of psychological collapse, isolation, addiction, delusion, and despair. Each case tells the same story. Trauma creates cracks, and those cracks, left untreated, become fault lines. Attachment theory explains this with painful simplicity. In early life, consistent emotional care wires the brain for empathy and self-regulation. Inconsistency, neglect, abuse, or emotional volatility wires it for fear and disconnection. When love becomes unpredictable, the mind stops trusting it. The result isn't always violence, but when combined with genetics and environment, it can birth something far darker. Science confirms these patterns. Neuroimaging studies show that psychopathic individuals exhibit 25 to 30% less activity in the amygdala, the region responsible for emotional processing. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, crucial for moral judgment, also shows significant hypoactivity. This means that for a psychopath, moral reasoning isn't felt, it's calculated. They understand right and wrong intellectually, but feel no emotional consequence for crossing that line. One striking experiment at the University of Wisconsin scanned the brains of convicted murderers while showing them images of suffering. Most of us would react instantly, flinching, cringing, or feeling discomfort. Their scans remained still. No surge, no flicker, no empathy response. It's as if the emotional volume knob in their brain was turned all the way down. But biology isn't destiny. Not all people with these neural differences become violent. In fact, many lead functional, even successful lives, thriving in high-risk fields that reward decisiveness and lack of fear. This suggests a chilling truth. The same traits that define predators can, in the right context, define leaders. The difference lies in control. When the need for power is channeled into creation, it builds empires. When it's left ungoverned, it destroys lives. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the birthplace of modern profiling, discovered another common thread. In over 90% of serial homicide cases, childhood trauma, whether physical, sexual, or emotional, was a defining factor. Violence, it turns out, is learned. But what's learned can also be unlearned if identified in time. Patterns emerge with eerie consistency. A fascination with control, a lack of empathy, an internal void filled by external dominance. In Case After Case, from John Wayne Gacy, the suburban contractor who buried his victims beneath his home, to Aileen Wuornos, who described killing as survival, the same neural architecture is at play. Their crimes look different, but the internal narrative is identical. I am powerless, therefore I must dominate. I am unseen, therefore I must make the world remember me. But here's the paradox that society struggles with. The moment we understand them, we risk humanizing them. And that feels wrong, because empathy for a killer feels like betrayal to the victim. Yet understanding is not forgiveness. It's prevention. When we view the killer not as a monster, but as a malfunction, we strip away the mythology that blinds us. We stop chasing shadows and start recognizing patterns. Ethically, this is the hardest truth to accept. Evil, in most cases, is an emergent property of pain left untreated. That doesn't mean the acts are excusable. Far from it. Accountability remains absolute. But if we ever want to stop creating new killers, we must trace the origin, not just the outcome. Because for every Bundy or Dahmer caught, there are thousands more minds quietly fracturing under pressure, unseen, undiagnosed, misunderstood. Psychological evidence supports this shift. Longitudinal studies from the National Institute of Mental Health show that early intervention in at-risk youth, those showing impulsivity, cruelty, or detachment, reduces later violent behavior by up to 70%. When therapy, empathy training, and stable emotional environments replace punishment, the cycle begins to weaken. The proof is both sobering and hopeful. Neuroscience tells us that empathy can be strengthened. The brain isn't static, it's plastic. Functional MRI studies reveal that consistent exposure to compassionate experiences, whether real or virtual, can increase activation in empathy-related circuits. The very areas that lie dormant in the psychopathic mind can be partially reawakened under the right conditions. That means the battle against violence isn't fought in prisons. It's fought in childhood bedrooms, classrooms, and family dinners. So where does that leave us? In the uncomfortable middle ground, where understanding a killer doesn't mean excusing him, but refusing to turn away. Because every time society labels evil as unexplainable, it absolves itself of responsibility. Understanding means accountability. It means recognizing that the line between sanity and savagery is drawn not by nature, but by nurture, chance, and circumstance. And in that understanding lies a difficult kind of peace. The peace that comes from knowing that darkness isn't infinite. It's measurable, mappable, even predictable. Because the same science that explains destruction can guide us toward prevention. And perhaps that's the most powerful transformation of all, when knowledge turns fear into foresight and empathy becomes humanity's most radical defense.